going to try to just open that door and see if we can address the whole range of possibility of dyeing fabric with Procyon MX dyes. Everything I'm talking about today is explained at greater length in the handouts that you can connect to. I want to answer the questions that were submitted. I realized there were some questions that were not submitted that I should probably address, thinking about what people already know. I mean, a lot of you've dyed fabric. A lot of us have done things and then we kind of took an angle on it and forgot all the other possibilities. I'd like to just stress briefly that when I say paint, I'm talking about painting dyes. I'm using dye with water, I'm using dye with thickener. It's confusing because there's the word dye, there's the word paint. When I use the word paint, I have to say to somebody, what do you mean, paint? Are you painting dye? Are you painting paint? Because dye is a chemical bond with the fabric. It makes the fabric change color chemically, and there is no adhesive, there's nothing to make like a pigment that would be in a paint, nothing to hold it except the chemical bond. So when you're all done dyeing the fabric, it feels like the original fabric you started with, which is particularly important if you do a lot of embellishing or working with your hand, if you want it to look like a bumpy silk and so on. So I got started dye painting. The other thing about dyeing fabric is the Procyon MX dyes are the best dye you can get for wash and light fastness. That is, if you dye it correctly and you put it in a hot wash when you're all done, what you have is absolutely as good a fastness as you can get to washing, and as we hang things on walls, it becomes apparent that they fade. And nothing is perfect to fading, but these dyes are as good as we can get. They're safe to use, they're economical, and they're, as you will see, quite versatile. You're maybe familiar with my books, the one on the left, Color by Accident. I don't know if you have any idea. It was 1997 when I wrote that book. I had been dyeing fabric in giant buckets for years, and in the early 90s, I gave that up. And yes, the book is out of print. The whole thing is available in a free download from my website. The other book on the right is its companion because it uses the exact same soda recipe, the exact same dye concentrate recipe, and it's the same dyes, except that they're different applications. This is a second edition. I revised it a couple of years ago, and it is available in print, and you can find it on the web. So what I want to emphasize is that these dyes are pretty simple to use. The reason I started using them when I was researching dyes is way back in the 70s, is that I didn't want to create a big steamer. I didn't want to have to steam iron them. These are room temperature dyes. They do not require heat or steam to fix. That is a huge barrier to a home dyer. So dye painting and low water immersion dyeing both use the same dye concentrate. The last step is washing. It is not an extra step, and we'll get to that, more of that later. And one of the questions was working over more than one day, and this was my immediate problem because when I started dyeing fabric, I had two little boys 20 months apart in age. I was doing 4 dozen diapers a day in the washing machine. I didn't have a lot of time to set up every time. And so what you can do is you can prepare the fabric, you can rip it to size, soak it or not. You can mix the print paste and store it. You can mix the urea water and store it. You can mix your soda solution and store it. And you can mix these powdered dyes, you can mix them into a concentrate and you can refrigerate them. All of these things can be prepared in advance and then put on the shelf. And when the baby's taking a nap, you can go grab it and put it on the table and get busy. You don't need to worry about if the dye concentrates are too cold because they warm up when you mix them with the print paste and you put them on the table on the fabric in a room temperature room. These are the basic rules for fabric dyeing. You put the dye on the fabric, you fix the dye with soda ash, You allow some time for it to react with the fabric. And in the case of low water immersion dyeing, it's only an hour after the soda's on. In the case of dye painting, it's at least 4 hours at room temperature with some moisture in the fabric. And the last step is washing out the dye. And what do people do the most? They forget the soda. So just a little reminder from my niece. Now the DVD, I prepared this DVD, is color by accident only. It's only low water immersion dyeing. But I did it 15 years after I wrote the book. I had 15 years of not only doing a lot of dyeing, but traveling all over and teaching and trying new things. Everywhere I went, I've always learned just as much when I teach as what I teach. There's always some new idea that comes, and after 15 years of trying new things, I decided it had to be done as a video. You can get the idea of moving your hands better, and your motion with your how you manipulate the fabric is more important almost than anything else you do with the fabric. So these are some of the questions that I had, and these are the short answers. You know, I could go on and on about all of this, but basically the soda ash, you can keep it till it's used up. The dye concentrates mixed with water in the refrigerator lasts quite a long time. I have a sample to show you in a minute. The print paste, keep it till it isn't thick anymore until it gets moldy. If you lived in a hot climate somewhere, you might want to refrigerate it, but not in Oregon. Once you mix the dye concentrate with the print paste, however, I try to use it the same day. And the dye powders, you buy them in a powder form directly from the dye company, and they'll tell you 2 years, and I'll say it could be a lot longer, and they'll tell you that too. And you can test them to see before you think about throwing them away. And if you've soaked your fabric and it's all dry and you're waiting to dye it and you haven't gotten to it, it's been a month, it's been a year. I have pieces of fabric on the shelf with soda on them. It's been over a year, so that's not a problem. I guess the safety issue with dyes is that you don't want to breathe these powders. And the powders are extremely finely ground up. So they float. They'll just float around in the air. So you wear a mask. You know, I had a stack of N95 masks before this thing broke out because I use them when I measure the dye. I put on a mask, I measure it in my sink. Any powder that floats around drops into the wet sink. And then any other time I want to use a dye, I'm using a liquid. So I'm not in danger of breathing the powders. If I were to put it in my refrigerator, I did back in the day, I would put tape over it because so nobody would drink it. It's kind of pretty colors. Here's this example. This is a piece of fabric. I happen to know when I did this because I dyed it the day before I started a project that I wanted to use black. And you see up here it says new. I had some dyes, concentrates in the refrigerator. Do you see these numbers down the side? They were all in the refrigerator 2 months, 4 months, 4 plus 2 months. And I mixed a new batch of black dye concentrate, and I mixed it with thickener, and I painted it on a piece of soda soaked cotton. I ripped it, so there's one piece over here not washed, and I washed this piece. And these are the results after 2 months, 4 months. Turquoise, it's always a little more color loss, and so on. So I looked at this and I looked at that black and I said, no, I don't want charcoal. I want black, because I didn't want to paint over. This is what I painted that week. It probably took me a week to paint the black and then another week to paint the red and blue. And I didn't want to paint over it again because this was a very bumpy absorbent silk and oil. And so if you're painting on really thick fabric, it takes more dye. And if you are low water immersion dyeing different sizes of pieces of fabric, of course, you're gonna, if you have a quarter of a yard, like I often do in classes, you would use less dye than a yard. In fact, you'd use a quarter the amount. And the reason I put this chart in color by accident is because just to show you the relative amounts. If you want a very pale color, you're going to use a teaspoon of dye concentrate in your total of a cup of water, okay? And if you want a really dark color, your cup of water is going to be half dye concentrate. It's going to be 8 tablespoons of dye concentrate and 8 tablespoons of dye. And some of the reason why people don't get the dark colors they want is because they don't use enough dye. Anyway, so all of my dye recipes in color by accident. And most of the time, I am dyeing on fabric that I can quilt through by hand or by machine. Sometimes I'm using a real heavy canvas or something like I've dyed cotton velveteen. Well, how do you know how much dye? This is my rule of thumb right there. The last 3 lines. Thoroughly wet the fabric with warm water. However much water it takes to get it completely wet, not very much extra water in the box. That's the amount of dye and water that you should prepare, and that's the amount of soda water you should use. So I've been working on fabric that is 100, well, a lot of my fabric is 64 inches wide, and some of it's sateen, which is a little heavier. So it's kind of hard to calculate what's a yard of that compared to a 44-inch quilting cotton. So this is how I calculate that. So what do you need in your workspace? I worked in a den. I worked in bedrooms in various houses. And finally, my studio was a bedroom we put a sink in. You don't need to have everything at your elbow. You can work in the kitchen if you need to. If you don't have water in the room, you can manage. I don't like to work outdoors. You can't control the fabric, the wind, the dyeing, the light, the heat. And I like to work on a table. I don't like to work on my hands and knees. Or, I mean, I dyed a piece of fabric in the bathtub one year because I didn't have a big enough container. Well, I only did that once. I mean, you want to have a table, and and that was before I knew about low water immersion dyeing. That was the end of it, in fact. And if you get messy, it's up to you. You know, I always say, well, if you spill it, wipe it up. You know, and it's no big deal. This stuff doesn't stay in the sink, and it doesn't stay in vinyl flooring and so on. I don't like to see it all over the walls. I don't like to see it all over my hands, personally. So here we are. This has been on my website for a long time. These are 2 pages from a 25-page handout you can download. Anybody who's bought the DVD, you know, I'm not sure if everybody's aware, but every chapter has notes, and it has, notes and recipes and projects. Now, they're not all the recipes, and they're not even the recipes necessarily that I demonstrated, but they are suggestions for you. One of the questions people asked me was, what kind of fabric do you dye? Well, all the fabric I used is on page 4 of this handout. All of the fabric that's in the DVD. And I rarely use other fabrics. Occasionally I do, but I wouldn't know if their fabric manufacturers change their product and keep the same name often. It's confusing. That's why I've listed the manufacturers and the products that I have used. I wouldn't limit myself to these, but I would want to be sure that I was getting results as good as these if I was buying some other kind of fabric. This is new on my website. I basically just made a PDF out of the last chapter of Color by Design edition, the 2nd edition. The chapter 12 is about what's this, what's that, why this, why that, and the very first most important question that everyone asks me is, what happened? Why are the colors lighter than I thought they were going to be? And there's lots of reasons for that. One I didn't put on this list is if you are using fabric, let's see, let me how to say this. I teach low water immersion dyeing class of 20. And I tell everybody, bring some swatches of white fabric that you have been dyeing or that you want to dye. And we put them all in the same bucket. And it never fails. There's at least 4 or 5. Some of them are part polyester. Some of them just don't absorb the dye well. And some of them are unmercerized raw goods that don't reflect the light very well. Anyway, the other one, the most important one I put a star by is a lot of people just don't use enough dye. When you're dye painting, you mix the dye with print paste, and you've got this mixture, and you look at it and say, well, that's nice and dark. But if you paint it on the fabric, then you're not looking through a whole pot of dye. You're looking through just a streak on the fabric. And you're also looking at it wet. Anyway, these are some of the other problems. I mean, I've even had people say, well, I put soda on the fabric, and then I said, well, but then they put it in the washing machine sprayed water while they were spinning out the excess soda ash. So they washed out all the soda. Or they hung it on the clothesline and it snowed and wet the fabric and diluted the soda ash. Basically, it's not a hard problem. You need to have the soda ash on the fabric. And this is the first 2 pages of that chapter. There's more online. I don't see any point showing them all the pages to you, but I wanted you to see that this is the first and most important question. I want the color to look like what it looks like, what I think it's going to look like. And that's what I expect. The last step of washing is the last step of dyeing fabric. And I do use a front-loading washing machine. And I talk about the washing out, and when I say hot, I mean 140 degrees. And a lot of us have run into issues now because the tap water isn't that hot. The solution is to get a washing machine that heats the water. Or you could get a hot water heater that heats it hot enough. When I built this new studio I'm in, new now, it's been 18 years, I had an on-demand water heater put in, and I told the contractor I wanted 140 degree water. He said, oh, you can't do that. And I said, well, I'm sorry, we must be able to do this. And he said, oh, he's looked it up and he found that I could get an auxiliary thermostat and I could set it up to 140 or 50 if I wanted. And it's on demand, so it comes out after it runs through the cold pipes, it runs out that temperature. And I don't worry about running out of the hot water. So there's a whole handout on my website. You can look it up. I've got a whole page about the pros and cons, and maybe the features of a washing machine you might want to look for.